You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Now presenting Spanish Flu Part 2. Section 1. Transmission and Mutation. The virus in question had an initial reproduction number ranging from 2 to 3. The dense living conditions and large-scale troop movements characteristic of World War I exacerbated the spread of the pandemic by not only promoting transmission, but also potentially encouraging the virus to mutate. The rigorous conditions of war might have also compromised the resilience of individuals to the virus. There are theories suggesting that soldiers' immune systems could have been compromised due to insufficient nutrition, the strain of warfare, and exposure to chemical warfare, making them more prone to infection. Global travel played a significant role in the pandemic's spread. Advances in transportation allowed for faster movement of infected individuals, whether they were military personnel, sailors, or civilians. Efforts to contain the disease were also undermined by government misinformation and denial, which left populations unprepared to deal with the pandemic. The particularly severe second wave of the pandemic has been linked to wartime's conditions. Under normal circumstances, milder forms of a virus circulate more because seriously sick people tend to stay home, while those less affected continue their daily activities, inadvertently spreading the less severe strains of the virus. However, in the wartime environment, this dynamic was reversed. Soldiers with mild versions of the illness remained in combat, while those with severe symptoms were transported in crowded conditions to overcrowded medical facilities, hence spreading the more virulent strain. The resurrection of the virus during the second wave led to a rapid global spread. It was observed that having been infected during the first wave likely led to immunity against the second wave, as evidenced by Copenhagen's notably low mortality rates due to its exposure to the milder first wave. This was not the case for most other populations, who faced a more lethal second wave, especially those young and healthy like the soldiers. The abrupt decrease in new cases and the lowered lethality of the illness following the second wave of 1918 have been subject to speculation regarding the reasons behind this pattern. One notion is that medical professionals got better at preventing and treating secondary pneumonia infections following the initial viral infection. Yet, according to John Barry in his 2004 book, there's no solid proof for this theory. Another theory suggests that the virus evolved quickly into a less deadly form, something often seen with influenza viruses, as deadlier strains can die out when they kill their hosts too quickly. Nonetheless, fatal cases persisted into 1919, as highlighted by the death of ice hockey player Joe Hall after an outbreak that led to the cancellation of the Stanley Cup Finals that year. Section 2. Signs and Symptoms. Most people infected in the initial outbreak of the disease experience common flu-like symptoms, such as sore throat, headaches, and fever. However, in a subsequent, more severe outbreak, the illness often escalated to bacterial pneumonia, which frequently led to fatalities. In these serious cases, individuals would develop distinctive deep purple patches on their cheeks, which would spread and turn their entire face blue within a few hours, and then a blackening of the extremities would appear, progressing to the limbs and torso. Death usually occurred swiftly afterwards, as fluids filled the lungs. Additional reported symptoms included bleeding from the mouth and nose, miscarriages among pregnant women, a unique odor, as well as the loss of teeth and hair, confusion, dizziness, sleeplessness, and problems with hearing, smell, and sight. Notably, bleeding often occurred from mucosal surfaces, including the nose, stomach, and intestines, as well as from the ears and small dots under the skin. These intense symptoms were attributed to what is known as cytokine storms, an overreaction of the body's immune system. The primary cause of death was bacterial pneumonia, which arose as a secondary infection in individuals weakened by influenza. This pneumonia was a result of opportunistic bacteria that typically inhabit the upper respiratory tract, seizing the chance to invade the lungs through the damaged airways. The virus itself also had a direct lethal effect by inducing extensive bleeding and swelling in the lungs. Advanced research has demonstrated that the virus was exceptionally deadly because it incited a cytokine storm. Some researchers have even resurrected the virus from preserved samples from perished victims and observed its lethality in lab animals, which experienced rapid respiratory failure and death due to cytokine storms. It was hypothesized that the robust immune responses in young adults led to more extensive damage within their bodies, whereas children and middle-aged adults, with their less vigorous immune responses, tended to have better survival rates. Section 3. Misdiagnosis. Difficulties in identifying the correct cause of a disease arose because the responsible virus was too minuscule to be seen with the microscopes available at the time. Instead, the bacteria Haemophilus influenzae was incorrectly believed to be the culprit, as it could be observed under a microscope and was found in numerous cases, though not universally. A vaccine targeting this bacteria was employed. While it did not reduce the number of infections, it helped lower the mortality rate. Amid the especially lethal second wave of the disease, there was widespread concern that the outbreak could be the result of other illnesses, such as plague, dengue fever, or cholera. Misidentification of the illness as typhus was also prevalent. Typhus typically spreads in times of social unrest, as evidenced by its spread in Russia following the October Revolution. In Chile, where societal leaders perceived a decline in national conditions, doctors initially attributed the sickness to typhus, spurred by unsanitary conditions, rather than recognizing it as a contagious disease. This misjudgment led to an ineffective response, highlighted by the failure to prohibit large public gatherings. Section 4. The role of climate conditions. Research indicates that the harsh environmental conditions of the time, marked by unusually cold and wet weather, compromised the immune defenses of those afflicted by the Spanish flu. World War I soldiers were particularly susceptible as they endured relentless rain and below-average temperatures, which persisted throughout the conflict and were pronounced during the pandemic's deadliest phase. Scholars from Harvard University and the University of Maine's Climate Change Institute have meticulously linked a severe weather anomaly in Europe between 1914 and 1919 to the heightened intensity and spread of the Spanish flu. Data show a marked upsurge in rainfall engulfing the continent during the pandemic's second surge between September and December 1918, which aligned with a spike in death rates and a dip in temperatures. The cold, damp conditions likely created a breeding ground for the virus and hindered human immune responses, leading to a higher susceptibility to the virus and associated bacterial infections. Such infections were rampant among victims, with about 20% suffering from them and a 36% fatality rate. The 6-year period of unusual climate was characterized by an influx of chilly sea air over Europe, fundamentally altering the weather patterns, as corroborated by both first-hand accounts and scientific measurements, and even extending to areas like Gallipoli in Turkey, where Australian and New Zealand troops faced severe cold, contrary to the region's typical climate. This anomaly may also have influenced bird migration patterns, particularly of those carrying the H1N1 virus, which led to high rates of infection through water contaminated by their droppings in the fall. The anomaly and its link to human activities have been theorized, suggesting that relentless shelling during the war generated large amounts of atmospheric dust, which in turn facilitated cloud formation and increased rainfall by providing particles for water condensation. Section 5. Public Health Management. In 1918, existing mechanisms to notify health authorities about rapid disease transmission did not routinely cover influenza, contributing to a slower reaction to the pandemic. Despite this, several precautions were implemented. Countries including Iceland, Australia, and American Samoa implemented maritime quarantines that proved successful in protecting their populations. Practices to maintain distance between individuals were adopted, including the shuttering of educational institutions, entertainment venues, and religious establishments, as well as restrictions on public transport and large gatherings. Mask wearing was adopted in areas like Japan, although there was public debate and some opposition to their use, with groups like San Francisco's Anti-Mask League challenging mandates. Vaccines were produced, but they targeted bacteria known to cause secondary infections rather than the influenza virus itself, thus offering limited protection. The degree of rigor with which safety measures were enforced varied, with New York City implementing staggered work hours to reduce congestion in public transport. Subsequent analysis suggested that early and sustained implementation of interventions like banning large gatherings and enforcing mask wearing could have halved the death toll. However, their effectiveness was critically dependent on the timing and consistency of the measures. Section 6. Medical treatment. Since there were no specific antiviral medications available for the virus and no antibiotics to address subsequent bacterial complications, healthcare providers turned to a hodgepodge of treatments, the efficacy of which differed greatly. These included common remedies of the period like aspirin and quinine, along with more toxic substances like arsenic and heart medications such as digitalis. They also used potentially dangerous compounds like strychnine and more benign substances like Epsom salts, castor oil, and iodine. Additionally, various traditional healing practices, including the ancient technique of bloodletting, Indian Ayurvedic therapy, and Japanese Kampo medicine, were employed in attempts to cure patients. Section 7. Information Dissemination. During the First World War, many nations imposed censorship designed to keep wartime morale high, which led to the suppression of information about the pandemic. As an example, the Italian publication Corriere della Sera was restricted from publishing the numbers of daily fatalities. Newspapers of the era tended to act in a way that aimed to protect the public from alarming news, out of concern that it could cause widespread fear. At the same time, false information about the disease was rampant. In Ireland, there was a prevalent myth that harmful gases from the large burial sites in Flanders Fields were being spread globally by the wind. There were also unfounded accusations that the Germans were using the pandemic as a form of biological warfare, with speculations that they were contaminating Bayer's aspirin or deploying poisonous gas from their submarines. Section 8. Mortality around the globe. The Spanish flu pandemic reached an enormous scale, infecting about 500 million people worldwide, which was 1/3 of the global population at the time. The exact number of deaths varies according to different estimates, but the event is acknowledged as one of the most lethal pandemics in recorded history. An initial calculation from 1927 suggested that about 21.6 million individuals died from the flu. Later estimates increased the number significantly. One from 1991 indicated a death toll of 25 to 39 million people, while a 2005 evaluation raised the possible fatalities to 50 million and even up to 100 million in the higher range. In contrast, a 2018 study published in the American Journal of Epidemiology contested these higher numbers, proposing around 17 million deaths, though this figure is debated. Given the global population was between 1.8 and 1.9 billion, the mortality rate due to the pandemic ranged between 1% and 6%. A 2009 research study using data from 14 European countries estimated that the Spanish flu caused approximately 2.64 million additional deaths in Europe during the intense period of 1918 and 1919. This aligned with earlier studies that estimated European fatalities to be 2 to 2.3 million. Europe's mortality rate was around 1.1% of its population at the time, around 250 million, which was significantly higher than the United States. This heightened rate of mortality in Europe is speculated to be due to the exacerbating conditions of World War I. For instance, the UK saw a markedly lower death rate of 0.28% to 0.4%. In India, which suffered substantially, anywhere from 12 to 17 million people perished, accounting for roughly 5% of the population. India experienced the only population decline over a census period primarily because of the flu's devastation. Although India was struck hard, some believe other conditions may have contributed to the high death rates there. A Lancet study indicated a stark variance in mortality across different Indian provinces. In Finland, 20,000 people died out of 210,000 cases, and in Sweden, there were 34,000 deaths. In Japan, close to 500,000 people succumbed to the flu across 2 outbreaks between 1918 and 1920. In the Dutch East Indies, now known as Indonesia, it is thought that 1.5 million died among a population of 30 million. Pacific Islands experienced devastating loss. For example, 13% of Tahiti's population and 22% of Western Samoa's population died in short spans. In Istanbul, the flu claimed the lives of 6,403 to 10,000 people, resulting in a mortality rate of at least 0.56%. The outcome was grim in other parts of the world as well. New Zealand lost approximately 6,400 Pākehā and 2,500 Maori within 6 weeks, with the indigenous Maori dying at a rate 8 times higher than Pākehā. Australia suffered 12,000 to 20,000 deaths, maintaining one of the lowest death rates internationally, although up to 40% of its inhabitants were infected. In certain Aboriginal communities, the mortality rate reached 50%. The U.S. experienced around 28% of its population infected, with deaths ranging from 500,000 to 850,000. Native American populations were particularly affected. In Brazil, the flu claimed 300,000 lives, including that of President Rodrigues Alves. The UK and France suffered significant losses, with up to 250,000 and more than 400,000 deaths, respectively. In Ghana, at least 100,000 died. Tafari Makanin of Ethiopia, who would later become Emperor Haile Selassie, was among the survivors of the flu, which took thousands of lives in the capital city of Addis Ababa alone. Estimates for fatalities in Russia varied greatly. One suggestion placed the death toll at 450,000, roughly 0.4% of the population, which would be the lowest mortality in Europe. Nonetheless, considering the ongoing civil war and social disruption, another study argued that the true figure might be closer to 2%, equating to around 2.7 million deaths. Section 9. Devastated communities. In areas with low death rates, the influenza outbreak still caused major disruptions to daily activities because many adults were too sick to function normally. Certain communities had to shut down their stores or ask customers to leave their shopping lists outside to be filled. The illness was so widespread that healthcare workers struggled to care for the sick, and gravediggers were unable to bury the dead, leading to the use of steam shovels to dig mass graves where the deceased were buried without coffins. The impact of the pandemic was particularly devastating in Bristol Bay, Alaska, where indigenous communities saw a staggering 40% of their population die, resulting in some villages vanishing entirely. Nenana, Alaska, initially evaded the pandemic's reach until the spring of 1920, when it swept through the town, infecting most residents within the first 2 weeks of May and killing an estimated 10% of them, predominantly Alaska natives. The pandemic also ravaged several Pacific islands, introduced through contact with New Zealand, which didn't act quickly enough to stop infected ships from departing its ports. Tonga experienced an 8% fatality rate, Nauru 16%, and Fiji 5%, which equated to about 9,000 people. The most affected area was Western Samoa, under New Zealand's control since 1914, where 90% of the population contracted the flu and high death tolls were recorded, 30% among adult men, 22% among adult women, and 10% among children. In contrast, American Samoa remained free from the epidemic thanks to a blockade imposed by Governor John Martin Poyer. In Western Samoa, the flu spread rapidly among the higher social classes, particularly because of the practice of collecting oral histories from dying chiefs, which led to high infection rates among community leaders. In Iran, the pandemic coincided with a severe famine, resulting in particularly high mortality rates, with estimated deaths ranging from 8 to 22% of the entire population, reaching up to 2.43 million deaths. Ireland saw the Spanish flu causing 1/3 of all mortalities during its worst year. South Africa suffered around 300,000 deaths, which was about 6% of its population in just a 6-week span, with early government responses likely worsening the situation. The city of Kimberley lost nearly 1/4 of its working population. British Somaliland saw a death toll of 7% of its native population. with this high fatality rate attributed to an infection rate that could have hit 50% and severe symptoms thought to be caused by cytokine storms. Section 10. Less affected areas. In the midst of the Pacific Ocean, both American Samoa and the French-governed New Caledonia managed to avert any deaths from flu through rigorous isolation measures. Nevertheless, these measures could only delay the inevitable, as American Samoa saw an outbreak in 1926, with a quarter of its inhabitants falling ill and a death rate of 0.1%. New Caledonia experienced its outbreak in 1921, with extensive sickness and a similar death rate. Australia, too, evaded the first two waves of the pandemic by imposing quarantines. Iceland was able to shield a significant portion of its citizens, around a third, by cutting off access to its main road. By the end of the epidemic, the remote Brazilian island of Marajó had remained untouched by the disease, and St. Helena reported no fatalities. China's experience with the flu pandemic of 1918 presents a picture of uncertainty, largely due to the chaos of the warlord era, which impeded proper health data collection. While China seemed to have a less severe flu season, accounts from within the country painted a variable picture, with some inland areas perhaps suffering higher mortality rates. In 1991, researchers Patterson and Pyle initially put China's death toll at between 5 to 9 million, but this figure faced criticism for its methodology. Subsequently, IJIMA, in 1998, offered a lower estimate of 1 to 1.28 million deaths, factoring in data from Chinese coastal cities. The revised lower death rates were supported by the low impact of the flu in port cities like Hong Kong and the assumption that the flu did not penetrate deeply into rural China. Yet some reports, such as those from newspapers, postal services, and missionaries, do suggest the flu had a severe presence in rural areas. Coastal city data, especially from ports with significant foreign administrative presence, documented extensive medical details. In these cities like Hong Kong, Canton, Peking, Harbin, and Shanghai, mortality rates were noted as substantially lower than those in other parts of Asia. For instance, Hong Kong and Canton reported death rates of 0.25% and 0.32% respectively. Even in a populous city like Shanghai, only 266 Chinese deaths due to the flu were recorded in 1918. When these figures are considered on a broader scale, one could infer that China's overall mortality rate might have been below 1%, which was significantly lower than the global average of 3 to 5%. However, it is important to note that data from Hong Kong and Canton likely undercounted deaths, as they only included those in colonial hospitals. And Shanghai's statistics were restricted to the International Settlements Health section, missing the full extent of the pandemic in the city. Furthermore, rural parts of China such as Hulu County and Hebei Province encountered far greater fatalities, with a case fatality rate of 9.77% and a 0.79% death rate in the overall population during the peak months of October and November 1918. Section 11. Patterns of Fatality. During the influenza outbreak of 1918-1919, the majority of those who lost their lives were young adults. In the United States, individuals below 65 made up 99% of flu fatalities during this period, with 20 to 40-year-olds accounting for almost half. By 1920, the rate at which the flu was claiming lives among this younger demographic had significantly declined to 1/6 of what it was, though they still represented a vast majority, 92% of the flu's victims. Typically, flu is most lethal to the very young, the very old, and those with compromised immune systems, but this pandemic deviated from the norm. The unusual pattern may have resulted from the older population's previous exposure to the flu pandemic of 1889-1890, possibly giving them some level of immunity. John M. Barry, a historian, pointed out that pregnant women were exceptionally at risk, with studies showing extremely high mortality rates among hospitalized pregnant women, ranging from 23% to 71%. Moreover, a significant percentage of women who were pregnant and survived the ordeal still suffered the loss of their babies. Another peculiarity of the pandemic was its timing and reach. It spread during times of the year summer and autumn, when flu is not typically as active and had inconsistent impact levels across the globe. Asia, for instance, experienced death rates up to 30 times higher than certain European areas. The pandemic also struck Africa and Asia harder overall, in contrast to Europe and North America. Within continents, too, there were disparities. Hungary and Spain saw triple the mortality rates compared to Denmark, while within Africa, sub-Saharan regions fared worse than their northern counterparts. In Asia, the extremes in mortality rates could differ by up to tenfold. Urban areas suffered more heavily than rural ones, with variations among cities potentially influenced by exposure to the pandemic's initially milder wave, which might have conferred some immunity, as well as the implementation of measures like social distancing. Social class also played a role in the death toll, with a clear pattern in Oslo, Norway, where individuals living in more cramped conditions had higher mortality rates. Immigrants, particularly Italian Americans, recent arrivals at the time, were nearly twice as likely to die compared to average Americans, underscoring the impact of poor diets, overcrowded living conditions, and difficulty in accessing health care. Conversely, African Americans seemed to fare better during the pandemic. Moreover, males were more frequently victims compared to females, likely due to increased outdoor exposure and higher rates of underlying tuberculosis, except in India, where the situation was reversed, possibly due to the cultural practice of women tending to the sick and being subjected to poorer nutrition. Studies by he and colleagues in 2011 and 2013 investigated the pandemic's waves using mathematical models. They explored factors that influence the timing and severity of these waves, such as school schedules, temperature changes, and behavioral responses to the outbreak. Their findings indicated that while all three elements played a role, changes in human behavior had the most substantial impact on the disease's spread.